our next speaker, we have Adam Kaysen, Vice President at futurex. In his talk, Encryption is easy, key management is also easy. Adam will dispel common myths around key management and details a range of best practices built over many years in the crypto trenches. Let me tell you a little bit about Adam before we get started. He manages futurex channel, OEM, and technology partners ecosystem. He has a strong technical background and deep knowledge of hardware security models, cloud security, key management, and enterprise cryptographic ecosystems. He began his career at futurex as a solutions architect, working with enterprise customers worldwide on technology deployments, system architecture, and payment industry best practices. Please welcome Adam.
For joining today. My name is Adam Kaysen. I'm Vice President for Global and Strategic Alliances at futurex. And today we've got a fun topic that I know has come up in a lot of the other presentations so far this week and is really something we're seeing a lot of in the industry as a whole right now. And that's the topic of encryption key management. Now, quite often you hear a lot of people saying, well, encrypt everything, encrypt this, encrypt that. It's easy, don't worry about it. And yes, that is true, that the act of implementing cryptography, knowing which algorithms to use, and actually doing it is not that hard necessarily. But where it does get a little more challenging and where we see some organizations get tripped up a little bit is around the key management side of things. In particular, as you look to your own organization or those of your customers and how they're implementing key management, knowing the right policies, procedures, best practices, and being able to talk to the right resources to help guide you in that journey is absolutely critical. And so what we're going to talk about today would be the encryption key management maturity model, something that we've developed to help organizations gauge their own level of maturity and find out not only how to increase their maturity if they need it, but also to find out where in this continuum they belong. And so during this presentation, I'm going to help you figure out where your organization stands in that hierarchy, where you want to go, where you should be, and then how to get there. So I know we're going to have a period after this for question and answer. So please hang on to those questions and we'll look forward to getting to them just as soon as we're finished. And with that, let's go ahead and dive on in here. So like I mentioned, today we're going to be starting out by talking about what key management is and what it is not, and just why it needs to be complicated, or as we're saying here, not as complicated to implement. After that, we're going to talk about assessing your own maturity level and that of your organization for key management. We're going to talk about how to design user-friendly key management ecosystems. We're going to talk about what this means to not only the end user doing the implementation, but also developers of applications that incorporate cryptography and key management, and talk about a few other things in that area. We're going to look towards the future, and then finally, we're going to open up, like I said, for some Q&A. So just to begin, what is key management and why is it so important? So in modern day IT ecosystems, you have dozens, if not hundreds, of different applications that consume cryptographic resources, whether it's a code signing application where you need to offload the actual storage of signing keys to a hardware security module, whether it's a PKI application, whether it's databases, whether it's just all manner of different business applications. Organizations are looking to enhance and augment the security of those by externalizing key management. So if you think about how hardware security modules, or HSMs, are used in this environment, typically they're used for cryptographic processing. They encrypt data, they decrypt data, they sign data, they validate data. They do that very well. But in a typical ecosystem, the HSM does just that. You can kind of think of it like the engine of a car. Buying an HSM in many cases can be like buying a really good, really fast car engine. And then you have to go and build the car around it. Well, when you look at key management and you look at key management applications, key management solutions, ecosystems, that's kind of like saying, well, instead of me having to go and decide, well, I want this kind of steering wheel and I want it to be this color and I need to have 4 doors or 2 or whatever, looking at a key management solution is like saying, all right, let's get the whole car, let's get the whole package here that makes sense, not only from a raw encryption standpoint, but also from a policy standpoint, procedures, everything else like that. And it really is a combination of technology, processes, and people. And without all three of those things, and without a good balance between them, you're really in a tough spot with this. So, looking at that and looking at how we're going to outline those three items, the people, the process, the technology today, we framed this up around what we're calling the key management maturity matrix. And this is a set of guidelines and details that'll help organizations understand where their current level of key management maturity is. And what in particular we're going to focus on would be these 6 items here. So how do you manage encryption key storage? How do you manage encryption key indexing, the overall key life cycle, not just generation and deletion, but tracking, reissuance, policies, everything like that. How do you handle audits? How do you perform audits on the key material, whether it's an internal audit or an external audit for compliance purposes? Following that, how do you handle crypto agility? Many organizations and many of the people speaking at the encryption consulting event this week are talking about post-quantum cryptography and how organizations can manage that change from conventional cryptographic algorithms, RSA, ECC, et cetera, to post-quantum safe algorithms. Well, crypto agility is the concept through which organizations can make those changes easily. A highly agile organization is able to transition from one algorithm to another, and planning for that is part of knowing your key management maturity. And then finally, how are you enforcing policy on the key material? How are you defining what those policies are? Do you have a centralized team that manages them? How do you check and make sure those policies are being implemented clearly and deliberately? All 6 of these items are incorporated in our key management maturity matrix. Now, let's start. Let's start by looking at the absolute rock bottom, right? So, what if your key management strategy looks kind of like this? And to be fair, this isn't actually a real key management spreadsheet. In fact, I don't really have any clue where it's from. I did a Google search and pulled it up. I do see a column with Iron Man as the entry there. So I kind of got a little bit of a chuckle around that. But to be quite honest, it's not that far off from what we've seen before in some organizations that are new to key management. Quite often, organizations find themselves starting with key management spreadsheets that look kind of like this, or even perhaps worse, where as they grow and as they expand in their key management journey, they start to add on tracking, they start to do things like that. But really, they don't have any key management. And that's what we start out by calling the no key management model. And this model is typically used when maybe an internal application is developed and it's realized that cryptographic operations that require key management or external key material are being used. And so quite often organizations start out with this and say, well, we know we need to do code signing. And so great, let's have our lead developer go download some OpenSSL and oh well, it needs a key for it. All right, cool. Let's generate a key. Where are we going to store it? Well, let's store it on their laptop. We'll be good. We promise. We've trusted them for years, right? It's not the right way to do it, right? You're not storing keys within an HSM. You're not doing any indexing. You're not managing the life cycle. It's, well, we've got our code signing key for this example, and then we're done. Forget about it, right? Um, there are problems with that model, quite obviously. There are risks from a security perspective. There are risks from an ongoing operational perspective. What happens if the one person who's managing the storage of those keys leaves? Maybe they win the lottery and they go off and buy their own private island, right? We'll use a happy example there. What happens if there's a compromise? What happens if there's anything like that? There are a lot of scenarios here that organizations should be aware of that could happen when you're using the no key management model. And so just to clarify, as we talk through the overall key management maturity matrix here, there are going to be a lot of nuances to it. And I genuinely believe that, what you're going to see here, where we go from no key management to application specific key management to semi-centralized to fully centralized, not every organization needs to be in the complete top right-hand corner of the maturity model. I firmly believe that the no key management model is not a good one, and no one should be following that one. Really, it's a terrible model, and it introduces a whole lot of risks to the enterprise. But having a massive key management infrastructure, if you're just using it for a few applications, well, that also doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not always a good use of resources. And so part of what we're going to do today as we go through this is help you as an organization identify where in this continuum you belong. So what I found, the biggest thing that puts people in the no key management category is awareness. Typically, someone at this level of key management maturity lacks a fundamental awareness that there's even a problem. And so, primarily, we've been looking at this as an educational opportunity. And this is something where going out and talking to organizations and helping them realize, hey, you are in this category. Here's why it's problematic. Here are the vulnerabilities it's bringing to your organization. Here are the risks. Here's why it's less efficient. That's something that at this stage is probably most important. So education has to take a front seat there to begin with. And there are a lot of different resources out there to get that education, whether it's working with consultancies, whether it's taking certification tests and things like that incorporate key management, going through training, whether it's all sorts of different things. But education really is fundamental. Next up, we move into application-specific tools. And this is often where organizations either develop tools or they implement application-specific third-party tools. So if they're looking and they say, well, we've got our code signing application that we talked about previously, and you know what, maybe we want to incorporate TDE or transparent data encryption within our Oracle database, or use database encryption from Microsoft SQL, or any number of different providers out there. Well, maybe for some, they use integrated software-based encryption. Maybe for others, they offload key storage to something external. So sometimes this is where the HSM, or the hardware security module, will be introduced. Now, an HSM, for those of you who are not familiar, and I believe everybody is, but just to play it safe, an HSM is a purpose-built, tamper-evident, tamper-responsive device whose whole purpose in life is to protect sensitive data and to perform cryptographic operations. And there are a lot of different ways that HSMs can be deployed. Typically, it's either on premises as a hardware appliance or deployed as a cloud-based HSM. But all of them share some common functionality in between them. They all support common cryptographic algorithms. They typically all support common cryptographic interfaces like PKCS11, Java, JCA, JCE, Microsoft CNG, KMIP, which is the Key Management Interoperability Protocol, and they use these to integrate with applications. Now, these HSMs also traditionally go through a range of different certifications, such as FIPS 140-3 Level 3, or PCI HSM for HSMs that are used in a payment ecosystem. But getting back to it, quite often this level, the application-specific tool category, is where organizations begin rolling in hardware security modules. They say, all right, we're educated on the need for key management maturity or externalizing key management. We understand why it's not a secure practice to have your code signing keys stored on a developer's laptop. We understand we need to do that. Well, let's go get an HSM, or let's spin up a cloud HSM or something like that. Great, they do it. And usually with that, it takes the greatest, or it results in the greatest step forward in terms of their security, because you are storing those keys now inside that tamper-evident, tamper-responsive boundary. And so that's secure there. But you still run into some challenges around audits, around crypto agility, around policy. Often these areas are not handled as well. Because when you're using application-specific tools, you're kind of managing it on a one-to-one basis. And we often run into organizations where they've grown through acquisition, or they've created new business units, and each of these groups stands up their own HSM infrastructure. So you've got your HSM stack over here, you've got your others over here, maybe you've got your third or fourth over here. And while that may be okay from a security perspective, from a training perspective, from an ongoing operational cost perspective, from an overall organizational strategy perspective, that can be very difficult. And that's where we see organizations start to make their way into the semi-centrally managed category. Now, in this category, an organization has deployed a system that's capable of centrally managing keys, but one of two items typically occurs. The first being the tool they've deployed isn't extensive from a capability standpoint, and so the enterprise is limited as far as the applications that can interface with it. So maybe you've got a key management infrastructure that can handle integrating with most of your tools. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're running HSMs with a key management application that can support PKCS 11, Microsoft CNG, and Java JCA, JCE based applications, right? So those are all standards based cryptographic libraries. Most applications support those in the general purpose world for offloading key storage. But you know what? Maybe there are some that only support KMIP. And so as a result, they're fragmented. And so it's all right, we've got almost all of our applications managed using this one ecosystem. But we've got a few others that have to have bespoke solutions or something else like that. So with this, you're moving in a good direction. Um, and you're heading in the right way, but there's still some challenges. The second situation that we commonly see in this category, semi-centrally managed, is that an organization has deployed a mature system. It offers a large number of applications they integrate with. The provider of that key management offering has the agility to integrate with new applications, whether they are custom ones developed internally with the customer, or whether they're off the shelf ones that have external key management integration. And they're in the process, the organization deploying this is in the process of migrating applications to it. It's not something with this where you can show up one day and say, all right, great, snap my fingers, and we're going to be mature from a key management perspective. All applications that support key management are going to be integrated with it, and the sun is shining outside. It's not often like that. And it's kind of at this stage where we sometimes see a little bit of a valley of despair effect, where there can be a real disparity between the architects who are designing the system and the rest of the organization. And you can have all of the technology in the world, and it can be wonderful, but if it's complex to implement, if it requires the CFO to write a check with 6 zeros on the end to actually see the benefit of it, there's a good chance it's not going to go anywhere. And so for us, for everyone here today attending the Encryption Consulting Conference, really it's our job as security architects, it's our job as technology executives to make sure that we take this into account with this level in particular. It's not enough for you to walk in and say, hey, guess what? I've built a Ferrari engine. Now you need to figure out how to build the car around it. You've got to go in with a plan and say, if we as an organization want to move to the centrally managed or the semi-centrally managed level in the key management maturity matrix, is our organization ready for it? Do we have the right buy-in from all the different application groups? Do we have the funding necessary to do it? Are you able to handle internal audits, external audits? Do you get the full value of it? And I want to stop here for a minute and note that quite often we actually do see organizations that come to this level, the semi-centrally managed level, and they say, you know what, this is good for us for right now. We're fine kind of pausing right here and say, all right, we've got a half dozen different mission critical applications that we use centralized key management for. We may have others in the future, and we know we can add them, but we don't need to go beyond this. And that's fine. And this talk today and what we're discussing here is really all about identifying where you're at as an organization, making sure you don't go too far, or you don't go not far enough, or don't go, making sure you don't go too far, or you don't stay at too immature a level. And then finally, we've got The pinnacle of key management maturity. You're hardware backed, you're centrally managed. Life is good in this stage, right? And at this point, you've basically implemented a service-oriented architecture for cryptography in your organization. And this is good. You've got the ability to onboard new applications seamlessly. You've got the ability to be agile with new requirements that come out, either new algorithms or new trends in the industry, new key derivation methods that you need to take advantage of. You've got continual auditing to understand that not only is your environment designed according to best practices, you're looking and seeing what's going on next. What does the future hold? How do we do that? How do we stay up to date? You've got policies. You've got quite often a centralized team that manages those policies. So when a new application comes on board within the organization, it's part of the organizational culture to say, what do we need from a security perspective? What do we need from a key management perspective? Do we need to reach out to the encryption services and key management teams to help figure out what we do? And let's put in specific processes within the organization to make that happen. And at this stage in particular, boy, it's not just about the technology. It's about having the people and having the right processes in place, like we discussed earlier. And so when we look at what helps drive organizations to realize their key management maturity level and figure out where they're at, really there are three things that we commonly look at. The first is that the organizational culture has to be robust when it comes to implementing application security and cryptography. You need to have that top level management buy-in saying, hey, we do not want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal as the latest company to suffer a data breach. We need, for the sake of our customers, not only for meeting legislative requirements or data privacy requirements, but also because it's the right thing to do. We need to safeguard customer information. Secondly, they need to make sure that regulatory and audit requirements are hit. And I kind of touched on that with legislative requirements. And we're starting to see country-specific or region-specific data protection and data privacy legislation become more and more of a common thing these days. And then finally, looking at the application needs. Quite often the application needs and requirements are the primary driver, as application developers will come and say, hey, we need cryptographic keys. Help us out with this. Developers, project owners, they're all aware of common cryptographic attacks, or quite often they're aware of common cryptographic attacks. And those key management principles are put into place with them during their application development lifecycle. Now, as these requests increase, the need for additional key management maturity is needed. So as your organization is having more people ask, you need to be able to handle those requests and field those properly. And so sometimes when organizations realize that a centrally managed key management infrastructure is critical, they're a little bit of a challenge, or there are some challenges that come up in deploying it enterprise-wide. One challenge that they often face, that organizations often deal with when they're here in this level of the maturity matrix, is that their existing key management tools limit adoption. It's difficult for whatever reason, whether it's a technology reason, whether it's just slow adoption throughout the enterprise. That can be something that, when I mentioned a little bit that valley of despair earlier, sometimes organizations can get trapped here where they say, we know we need to do these things, but we struggle to get there. And that's why we really encourage talking to external stakeholders who have been there and done that and gone through the process before to help from a policy perspective there, and help figure out where you need to be. One of the key requirements, right, that we can't stress enough throughout this, and as we talk about practices that make key management easier, I want to lead this with this one. It's that it is hardware backed. Quite often, if you're looking at how to deploy key management within your organization and you're looking at software only tools, those typically hit the policy side, they hit the procedure side very well. But without that hardware backing from an HSM, it's really expending a lot of energy on something without taking into consideration one of the most important parts. Secondly, automated key lifecycle support. Policy, like I mentioned earlier, is so critical here. And knowing that you've got automated key lifecycle support in your solution is very, very important. Saying, all right, well, we've got new applications being onboarded. How do we do that? Who do we give access to allow that? What checks in the process are required? How do we reissue keys? How do we manage expiry dates? Things like that. Those all factor in here. Fourth, I talked about this before, but a little bit more common cryptographic interfaces. You don't want to be writing your applications to interface with nothing but custom, truly custom or bespoke interfaces. Really, you want to find things that are in common across your enterprise. PKCS11, Java, CNG, KMIP, etc. Having that continuity makes life a lot easier. And then finally, crypto agility and being able to transition to new algorithms as they come up. That's vital. And it means that you're not just going to be putting in one solution for today and saying, well, I'll be retired by the time it's someone else's problem. You're thinking about the future, and that's very important here. So next up, we've got the key management lifecycle. And this is something that when you're assessing your maturity as an organization from a key management standpoint, you need to think about all of these different steps here. Really going all the way from initial generation, how are keys generated? Are they generated using an HSM? Where are they stored? How do you exchange them with other devices or other applications that need them, or even other external service providers? How do you handle the policy around that? How do you handle workflow, certificate lifecycle, key lifecycle? And then finally, once you're done with them, how do you securely destroy them? And how do you track that with an auditable process throughout the whole thing? And one of the areas that I wanted to do a quick little spotlight on here would be policy enforcement and identity management. And these days, we're seeing such a dramatic and fast increase in the number of different identity providers out there and the number of different authentication mechanisms. And I won't go through each of these individually. And I will say that there are different levels of identity management that you can do. Some that offload that using a PKI managed by a strong cryptographic environment, for example. There are others that rely on one-time passwords or stateless tokens or things like that. But really, the message I want to get across with this slide is that you should think about policy enforcement and identity management, because you could have a very, very robust key management system. But if you've got one person, maybe at an outsourced service provider, who has control over that, well, did you really spend your money wisely on that key management system? And it goes back again to the process and the people side of things, in addition to the technology. You can't just have one or the other. And then finally, as we start to wrap up here, I wanted to talk about considerations for application developers. And this is something showing a few just different examples here of how different applications within an organization's core cryptographic infrastructure could integrate with key management. And so we've outlined a few different examples here. Like I mentioned earlier, there are hundreds of them out there, hundreds of different applications that support external key management. But part of an organization growing and reaching their maximum key management maturity is to take an inventory of what they have and say, all right, well, we know we've got these different application providers. We know we've got these different technologies. What is the process of integrating them into our key management ecosystem going to look like? How difficult is it? How critical is the data? How should we do that? And how should we move towards that maximum key management maturity level? Taking that inventory of what you have in your own ecosystem is critical for that. Understanding what you currently have in your environment, understanding where you want to be. That's what you need to do soon. And really, as I frame this up here within the next few weeks, the next few months, within the next 6 months to a year, these are the things that I would recommend doing. And first up is do that inventory. Find out what in your organization needs strong cryptography. Are there any things that you're currently using that don't integrate externally with a key management provider or an HSM that should? Is that data particularly sensitive? Are there things that you're using HSMs for that you might not need to? That doesn't come up as often. But are you effectively using your resources? Do you have any glaring holes in there that you need to patch up? After that, once you have that inventory, once you understand what your environment looks like, then you need to find out where you fall on that key management maturity matrix and find out where you want to be. And with that, it'll let you prioritize what to focus on. It'll let you start building or augmenting your key management and encryption services team. It'll let you become a little more mature or achieve the level that you want. And part of that is prioritization. And like I mentioned a few slides ago, it's wonderful to go in and say, encrypt everything. This is going to be fantastic. And then when it comes time to actually pay for it and implement it, oh, it's like, well, maybe we should have prioritized that a little bit more. And so understanding which of your environments, which applications, which types of data are the most sensitive. Maybe it's payment data that is within the scope of PCI compliance. Maybe it's customer data that's inside the scope of GDPR, LGPD, CCPA, all other different data privacy legislative requirements out there. Maybe it's something else entirely. And how are you prioritizing those? And then finally, within 6 months, and I'll give a little flexibility on this, within 6 months to a year, collaborate with your team, make a plan, understand what the impacts are going to be across your organization, and start doing it. Reach out to trusted consultants, reach out to people who've gone through this process before. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like events like this so much, is that it brings together people from all across the industry who've experienced this before. They've gone through the challenges, they've got the scars from it, and use those resources to your advantage. Talk to people, find out what worked for them, what didn't, and how you're going to incorporate that in your own key management journey. And so with that, that's really all I had for today. I wanted to thank Puneet and the rest of the encryption consulting team for putting on a fantastic event, as always. We're going to have a few minutes here for question and answer. And so hopefully some people have started thinking of those. So feel free to jump in momentarily with those. But for those of you who maybe don't have any today and want to follow up, I can be reached at akaysen@futurex.com. Thank you again for your time today. As always, it's been a pleasure.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Adam. And thank you. Great to have you live with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Adam, we're going to jump into it. I've got 5 questions for you
All right.
to get started with. So you kind of talked a little bit about this, near the end, but what are your recommendations if a company is looking at key management from scratch?
So, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, really, recommendations can kind of take a lot of different forms, but maybe I can come at it from more of a philosophical angle. And I think above everything else, really, sometimes key management can feel like a technology play, and it's very, very focused on that. But really, prior to that, it's almost a people play and a consensus play first, especially if you've got so many different groups across the enterprise that are dealing with different applications, and you're coming in and saying, hey, everybody, listen, this is going to be fantastic. We're deploying enterprise key management across our ecosystem. You may disrupt their lives a little bit. You may make things in their day-to-day jobs a little more difficult. Now, you should be able to articulate why that's better in the long run, but really planning for the organizational change management side and building that consensus from the start, saying, yes, as an organization, we understand why this is a priority. We understand why we're doing this, can really smooth the road further on from there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, you said philosophical, but that can be applied to so many things. If people don't know why the change is happening, it's pretty hard to embrace it. So, organizationally or technology wise. So, absolutely. Um, this next question, is there a tipping point when you commonly see an organization move to a more sophisticated key management model?
One of the things we see in that area, and it really does vary from organization to organization. Actually, 2 things. So one looking inside the organization and one looking outside the organization. Inside the organization, quite often that tipping point occurs when they get such a volume of encryption and key management related things going on in their organizational life that they need to hire or allocate dedicated people for it. Quite often in an organization's life cycle, they grow, and as they grow, they find that, oh, maybe the person who is handling their HSMs, and their key management is also the person fixing the receptionist's printer and dealing with provisioning new email addresses for new employees, and like things like that really don't make sense in the grand scheme of things to have all under one person's purview. So quite often when you have dedicated focus on security and that cryptographic side of security in particular, you start to see a little bit of maturing in that area. The other side, looking outside the organization, sometimes when emerging legislative or regulatory requirements start rearing their heads, that tends to up the importance of things within an organization there. So that's one other catalyst for it that we see quite often.
Yeah, nothing makes you move faster like when you gotta. So,
So that's the truth.
where does the cloud factor into all of this?
So that is a multifaceted question there, but I think we're seeing just a dramatic rise in cloud adoption these days, and honestly, practically every presentation so far this week have incorporated that in some way into them as some sort of talking point, and it's really another um, it's another thing to look at as far as different key management requirements go. So a lot of the different public cloud providers, the hyperscalers, for example, really all of them have some method of strong key management integrated into their service. In fact, really by default, a lot of them incorporate that. However, a lot of them are also incorporating EKM, or external key management. I heard a presentation yesterday that talked about BYOK and HYOK and BYOE, and all of that dovetails in here, where in addition to asking the questions of, hey, do we want our data encrypted using an HSM inside a unified key management ecosystem, you also have to ask, when you're dealing with clouds, are we comfortable with the cloud provider being the manager of that key management infrastructure, or does the organization want to have that in house? And there are good justifications for both ways. It's not a one is better than the other, black and white kind of thing. It's more uh, situation by situation, application by application, level of data criticality, um, type question, or series of questions, really.
Thanks, Adam. Um, how about this one? How can application vendors keep key management top of mind as a consideration in their offerings?
All right. So I like this one because I mean, obviously as a security guy, I like focusing on the security and seeing that grow. But when you think about the application vendors, I think it's cool because you're actually seeing some new commercial models develop these days, new revenue generation opportunities develop these days that didn't exist a few years ago. Where, especially if you tie it into the prior question about the cloud, you look at application providers out there that need to give their customers the assurance of a high security, strong key management ecosystem. And so, how do they do that? Well, typically they say, "All right, great. We now support private key offloading to an HSM, or externalizing cryptographic operations to an HSM, or external key management integration, and things like that." And that can be wonderful. It's quite often done at the demand of customers who want that to integrate it in their overall environment. But at the same time, it kind of creates a little bit of a speed bump in their sales cycle sometimes, um, where it's like, okay, we know as an application provider, we've sold the customer, they're good, they want to buy our product. Oh, by the way, now you've got to go talk to an HSM vendor and go through their sales cycle too, and that's one more step, that's one more hurdle, and I don't envy the application provider salespeople who have to deal with that, right? So for them to look at key management and HSM as a service and look at rolling it in natively into their own application, that can both remove that speed bump or that hurdle in the sales cycle, but it can also give them, the application provider, an opportunity to generate some extra revenue, to upcharge that, to charge for the very legitimate service associated with management, with compliance, with policy establishment, with support, everything like that.
So it's really a good win for the end user, for the application provider, and then also the service providers who are creating these cloud HSM offerings as well.
Thanks, Adam. I've got a good one to kind of summarize this presentation. Are there any industries that you see really leading the pack in terms of strong key management adaptation?
Hmm. So there are two that I can kind of think of just off the top of my head that are that we see a lot of interest in this area and have seen a lot of actual movement in, especially when it comes to consolidation. One would be the payments industry. So think banks, retailers, transaction processors, fintechs, anyone dealing with moving money around. And by and large, their growth into the strong key management space, I think, has been driven a lot by regulatory compliance requirements. So when you take an industry as heavily regulated as financial services with PCI, with other regulatory standards out there and guidelines, as well as actual legislative requirements, that creates a culture of security. It creates a culture of awareness around this type of technology. And so quite a few major organizations in that space started out by deploying this type of technology as a must-have solution, like have to have it. Law says so, has it. Uh, Started there, and then as they deployed that, they said, "Well, all right, we've got this infrastructure. We've got the ability to subdivide it out between applications, to parcel out cryptographic resources, and to allocate that in a way that makes sense. Now, why don't we spread that out throughout the organization to maybe some of our back-end business applications, to things that maybe are want to have needs rather than must have needs?" And so that's been fun to see that. And another concept that's kind of a fun one to talk about, that is another session for another day, but really increasing the return on investment of cryptographic infrastructure, like that concept right there is absolutely critical to that, where you say, all right, I have to have HSMs and strong key management for these use cases, but why don't I use excess capacity to improve my organization's overall security posture over here? That's good no matter how you look at it. And then another industry that I really think has done a lot in this area would be Internet of Things, or IoT device manufacturers. And for them, because if you're dealing with an organization that has millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of devices, whether they're phones or cars or connected toasters or whatever out in the field, they have to have a way to securely issue over the air firmware updates, to sign code, to track those devices where appropriate, to ensure confidentiality of communication between them. And so it's just another one of those existential need to have type things. So I would say, while we're seeing this in a lot of different industries right now, those two, payments and IoT, have really led the way from a lot of different angles.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. We've run out of time for questions, but remind us one more time, how can folks get a hold of you if they have any more questions?
Excuse me. Absolutely. So for anybody who has any other questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out. My email address is acason, ACASON, at futurex.com, or find me on LinkedIn, and we'll look forward to talking more soon.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. And we look forward to your session maybe next year on ROI.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Take care.